Okay. There's no mic in here, right? Alrighty, let's get started. Everybody survived the snow apocalypse, I take it. Or the cold apocalypse. I guess there wasn't that much snow. That's for later this week, I think. Okay. So I believe I'm having trouble remembering what happened last Wednesday, because that's the weird thing with a 2 times a week class that I feel like happens Monday, Wednesday. There's a really long time between Wednesday's class and today. So I'm like, I think we got through everything for doing social research. We got through all the slides. So I think we are good to start on research design. Before I do that, so just a reminder that tomorrow, right, is the first day of the labs with Joe. So they will be in business 1/80, I think, or 1-80. I think it's on E-Class or on Bear Tracks if you don't remember. And right, you're either in the 9 a.m. or 3:30 or 3 o'clock, I can't remember the exact times, section. You can swap between them like unofficially if you want. There's no problem at all with that. So if you miss the first one, because I know getting here at 9 in the morning sometimes is hard, and you want to go to the afternoon one, I have no problem with that, and everything is set up. So just remember, we have one this week, none next week, and then we'll talk about the schedule as we keep going. And yeah, Joe will be working with you on a few little activities to sort of get you started making research questions, and then oh, that's probably too dark. Yeah, that's too dark. I'm sorry. Is it nap time? I want it to be nap time. That's what's motivating me. Okay. So, yeah, the mini lab will be due. I believe it's on Sunday at midnight of this week. So, any questions? Anything? I don't know if people have swapped in. I have not been keeping an eye on anything. I've been trying to stop everything at my house from breaking down in the cold. Weirdly, my Wi-Fi just keeps like randomly dropping, and I'm going to blame the cold or TELUS. I don't know which. So I've not been like keeping an eye on the class enrollment or anything. Are there any questions before I kind of jump into new material for today? Anything at all? Nay. All right. Now I feel like that's too dark. I feel like I'm staring through the fog. So I'm going to turn that up a little again, and I'm just going to play with this all class. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about some research design. Okay. So research design, at the end of the day, what is research design? A framework for the collection and analysis of data, right? So you are, if you're doing social research or any kind of research, really, you need to collect data and you need to analyze that data. And so the research design is basically your plan for how are you going to do this, right? What are you going to use as a methodology? How are you going to analyze the data and all of these types of things? Okay, so key things, right? You need to ask, what is it that you're trying to learn, right? What do you want to figure out about people's social behavior, right? Or about their social lives? What is it you want to know? What is the nature of your research question? Are you dealing fundamentally with a quantitative or qualitative research question? Because that's going to affect, right, what kind of methodology you use, and what kind of explanation do you want? And they're typically either nomothetic or ideographic. And don't worry, I'll tell you what those are. Okay, so nomothetic explanations generally, or actually not generally, they're explanations that involve a cause and effect kind of relationship, right? Generally expressed in some kind of general law or principle, right? This happens because of this, right? X causes Y, right? This is the cause and effect relationship. Now, this is more typical of quantitative, and generally, right, when we look at this kind of thing, we're going to be talking about, correlation, because, I have it here, nomothetic explanations have to satisfy 3 criteria of causation. In social research, we tend to talk about correlation, and the adage of kind of social research is correlation doesn't always equal causation, right? Two things can be related, right, and without necessarily knowing whether one is causing the other. But so generally we talk about a correlation. We see some kind of correlation, and then you're going to sort of theorize that you think this is the causation, right? Always with the caveat that it could be something else. But you're also typically I don't know, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But typically, right, you're dealing with a dependent and independent variable, and you're thinking that the independent variable is the thing causing the change in the dependent variable. And we call that directionality, right? So the directionality of the correlation or the causation is going from this variable to that one. Now, it's always fun sometimes because some researcher looking at quantitative research and someone else's data might suggest that the directionality is inverted, right? So it'd be like, oh, I think that you said that, or everybody's assumed that X causes Y. I'm going to try and prove that Y actually causes X. I was reading a paper about this just before Christmas about declining religiosity and pornography use. And it's like, everybody's assumed that declining religiosity causes more pornography use, and the authors were theorizing that it was the other way around. So kind of interesting, an interesting kind of thesis and an interesting way of flipping that causation. Okay. Nomothetic explanations, typically quantitative, and they have to basically meet these three kind of criteria of causation, right? So there has to be a correlation, right? You have to have, whatever the change in your independent variable has to have a corresponding change in the dependent variable at, basically in the kind of sequence, right? So if you change your independent variable and your dependent variable doesn't change, right? There's no change, then obviously there's no correlation. And so, you fail that test. So if you were like, I think that, let's stick with religiosity for a second. I think that, younger people will be less religious than older people, right? So your independent variable is age. So you're like, okay, I'm going to take people in these age categories, and I'm assuming that, as we get younger and younger, they're going to report less religiosity. And you go, and actually they're all about the same religiosity. There's no correlation, right? Or, let's just stay with that. I'm going to keep it simple, right? There's no correlation, nothing's changing. So you can't have a nomothetic explanation because there's no correlation. The time order, right? So this time order is most specifically related to especially experimental designs. When we talk about experimental designs, though there's other ways that time order can apply. Time order, right? Basically, if the change in your dependent variable happens prior to the introduction of your independent variable, then ultimately you would fail the time order kind of thing, right? Where basically, your dependent variable was already changing prior to the introduction of your dependent variable. Your dependent variable was changing prior to the introduction of your independent variable. Then you're going to fail the time order, right? Because the change was happening prior, right? So it has to be ordered. You have to introduce your independent variable, and then the change happens in the dependent variable. And then it has to be non-spurious, right? So non-spurious means that there isn't a third or other variable causing the change in the dependent variable, right? So this one is a little bit harder to figure out sometimes, and sometimes what often happens is people miss a spurious kind of relationship. But for it to be truly a nomothetic explanation, there can't be something else affecting your dependent variable. Okay. And don't worry, we'll break this down a little bit more too. So, idiographic explanations basically involve really deep, rich, textual kind of descriptions of persons or groups, and you're seeking to explain something in particular, right? So this is more typical of qualitative research, right? Where what an idiographic explanation looks like is a long written account, typically of what you found in qualitative research, kind of giving deep, rich details about the group or person or whatever that you're studying, talking about their life and their views, how they see the world, right, in great detail. And it's basically meant, just to apply to that group and not to people who are not in the study, right? So it's particular to the particular social setting that you are looking at, right? And it's not necessarily looking at trying to make causal claims. It's a description of the reality that you're observing out in the world, right? So, ideographic, right? You're sort of like drawing or painting a picture in a sort of way, except with words. Don't actually paint a picture. I mean, in some schools of sociology, that might be okay. I don't know. But you're trying to like write a really detailed account that gives whatever reader you have a really deep look at the phenomenon that you studied. Okay. And again, right, empathic understanding there is key. Okay, so once you figure out, right, what kind of research you're doing, is it qualitative or quantitative, what kind of explanation you're going to come up with, you need to figure out what the best methodology is. And like I said, we're going to go through a ton of different methodologies as we get a little bit deeper into the course, right? We're going to look at a bunch of these in great detail. Now, I will say the top two, right, are respectively the most used methodologies in quantitative and qualitative research. So the most used one when we talk about quantitative research is the questionnaire or survey, right? And I use those terms interchangeably, right? I tend to prefer talking about surveys. Some people prefer talking about questionnaires. They're basically the same thing. So it's, that is the number one most used quantitative methodology. You send out a survey or you grab someone else's survey data and you analyze it statistically. Okay. In qualitative research, the most used methodology is the typically the semi-structured interview, right? Interviews of some kind, right? Either structured, semi-structured, or non-structured interviews. So interviews are the most common one. They are by far the easiest way to do qualitative research. That's not saying they're easy, but they're the easiest because you basically find people to interview, you talk to them. Yeah, please.
Which ones were questionnaires, qualitative or quantitative?
Questionnaires are quantitative. Yeah. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, and interviews are qualitative. So yeah, I mean, interviews, you know what interviews are, and we're gonna, in the second half of the course, after the midterm, we're gonna talk about qualitative research. So we'll put that to the one side. Other methodologies that we sometimes see, participant observation and ethnography, they kind of go hand in hand in a lot of cases. Ethnography includes a lot of things, but again, we'll talk about it after the midterm, which is basically observing people, right? Putting yourself in situations to observe people. And then experiments. Now, experiments in sociology tend to be somewhat rare because typically sociologists, and this is the sort of claim, will say that experiments are artificial situations, right? Where basically what we're interested in as sociologists, at least theoretically, is observing people as they actually are. And the second that you're doing an experiment, you're putting people in artificial situations. But, and so I've always said, we don't really do experiments in sociology, but that's not 100% true either. And I was talking with Phil Bowdy, who's the person who teaches the other section of Intro to Social Methods. And we were having this kind of debate, and I think he made a good point, which I'll share with you, is we sometimes do see experiments in sociology that can be really revealing. And things like they did these, what were they? They were basically like fake they were job interviews, right? Where basically they've tried like this in a couple of different kinds of ways. And they basically, kind of manipulated the one of the common ones is the name of the person on a CV, right? And so typically how this is done is they put a really typical one like John Smith, and then they put something that has especially like an African American black kind of name, right, on the same CV, and they submit both of them to some kind of job. And what they've found generally is that the ones that have the African American name have been less typically given interviews afterwards, right? So there's some kind of racial bias. And even, they then presented these to participants in the research study who filtered those out, right? So there's some situations in which experiments are done sociologically to see things. They're pretty rare just because, again, we're mostly interested in kind of people's actual social media, not creating artificial situations. But we'll talk about them again in slightly more detail. Yeah, so really commonly, and I'm sure, oh, sorry, go ahead. So ethnography typically ethnographies will involve a participant observation as part of it. Often ethnographies are a little bit broader, right? So an ethnography may also, and almost always does, also include semi-structured or unstructured interviews. So they typically are part of it, and they'll be a little bit broader as well. So there's different categories of participant observations, and you can go from, basically what you would call a complete participant, someone who is like, and typically this is done covertly, where you would be like, I don't know, I'll give you my terrible example. You want to study furries, right? And so you get yourself a furry costume, you don the head of a furry, and you walk into the furry convention, and you don't tell anyone who you are, that you're doing research, and you partake of the furry lifestyle as a total participant or a complete participant. Now, you can go and there's like gradients, right? Moving kind of from complete participant, I think, to complete observer. A complete observer is at the other end, where you would just be like, standing off, no one knows you're there, and you're just watching and not interacting at all. And then like in the middle, there's, I can't remember the term, it's escaping me right at the moment. Let's say you were wanting to understand, a particular program aimed at youth kind of justice and reform. You might be there kind of watching, everyone knows you're there, right? And you've told them who you are, or they've been told who you are, but you're not actually actively involved in, their discussions. You're just sitting there observing. And so so you're, whereas a complete observer, again, we'll talk about this when we talk about ethnography, but when you talk about a complete observer, you would be so removed from it that no one knows you're there. And so you're not worried about a reactive effect at all because no one knows you're there. And then a complete participant, you also aren't worried about reactive effects because, no one knows you're there because you're now completely participating. But typically we're somewhere in the middle, right? There are limits and differences at each end where there's ethical quandaries. Oh, there's definitely ethical quandaries to doing that kind of research, simply because, you're lying, right? You're essentially misrepresenting yourself, and you're not giving people informed consent. But don't worry, ethics is the next unit. We'll talk about ethics. We'll see how, maybe next week, maybe or on Wednesday. We'll see how far we get. But these are all really good questions. But yeah, I promise we'll talk about all of these things. And yeah, I mean, typically deception is not allowed in academic research anymore, except in very, very rare circumstances. Like very, very rare. But we'll talk about ethics. You'll probably be sick of it by the time we get through it. But sometimes people will make a case that in order to get real results, you have to be at that, complete participant end and covert, right? Because otherwise the reactive effects will wreck any kind of real sense of what's going on. But again, you'd have to slip it by, that's maybe loaded language. You'd have to convince the research ethics board of that before you ever went out and did that research. Sorry, does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Yeah, research ethics boards, they keep us from, treating people badly and abusing our research subjects. Okay, so what was I saying? I don't remember. Class dismissed. No, I'm kidding. Oh, yeah. I'm like secretly in my brain wondering if my daughter's bus will come this afternoon because it did not come this morning. I'm like, do I have to leave and go get her? I don't know. She can always go to Dairy Queen and wait for me. There's a Dairy Queen across from her school. It's not far. Okay, so true experiments, right? True experiments, really common in psychology. And if you've ever taken whatever the pairing is of Psych 102 or Psych 104, 105, right? Always there are like bonus marks given if you go and participate in somebody's research, right? Which I actually wonder about the ethical standards of this because I'm like, well, I guess you have the right not to participate, but then you don't earn extra credit, but whatever. That inducement seems a little odd to me. We'll talk about inducements later. Really common in psychology, right? And there's all sorts of experiments in psychology that have been done. And psychology, for whatever reason, is not as concerned about creating artificial circumstances and artificial conditions for people. They're much, much less concerned about this. Okay. In sociology and political science, right, much more interested in kind of real world and what people's actual kind of lived lives and experiences are rather than these artificial situations. And like I said, it doesn't mean that these never happen and that they can't be revelatory in some circumstances. It's just typically we don't see as much of it, right? And we end up much more in, quantitative research with questionnaires or surveys and interviews sociologically. So we'll talk a little bit about experiments here. But yeah, generally we don't see a ton of them. Like I said, Phil convinced me. He convinced me that actually, in some circumstances, they actually can be kind of useful, but not all the time. Okay, so, yeah, I mean, lots of things that when we talk about kind of sociologically, not everything is like, in terms of like creating experiments with like an independent variable that you manipulate, it's not always possible, right? Typically when we're talking about, say, independent variables in quantitative research, we're more often talking about like, something that's true of one set of subjects that's not true of the other, right? Things like age, right? Where we can measure how different ages perceive something or how different ages have a relationship to other things or socioeconomic status. We have much less kind of, a lot of the variables that we're interested in, right, can't actually be manipulated experimentally from a sociological perspective. So we don't do tons of them. Yeah, ethical concerns preclude performing a lot of experiments, kind of like what you were saying, that, there's ethical concerns all over the place. And some of the things that sociologists want to study, you can't actually manipulate experimentally from an ethical point of view. Yeah, and many phenomenon are long-term. And that's probably one of the, where you're not talking about people's immediate reactions the way psychology is, subjective states of mind. You're actually looking at, kind of how things play out over the long term. Longitudinal research is much more common in sociology than it is, say, psychology. And yeah, it has lots of complex causes that involve things like age, race, gender, socioeconomic class, and these sorts of things. So, yeah, and even where applicable, experimental models don't always get, they get at how people react to things, not always at the why, which is often what sociologists are more kind of interested in. Okay. So, two kinds of basic experiments, right? Field experiments, which when you do get sociological experiments, much more commonly you do find kind of that they are field experiments, right? Where basically you manipulate something in, the world to see how people will react to it, right? So what would that look like? I mean, there's some really, really famous ones in terms of social perceptions and things. One of them is, what's it called? The subway violinist experiment, right? Where basically they take someone, this was done in New York, and it was a classically trained, violinist who plays with the New York Philharmonic. And basically they put him in a subway station in two sort of circumstances. one in which, he was dressed in a tuxedo, and one in which he's dressed as like a homeless person playing the violin. And they measured things like how people reacted, whether people avoided him, whether people gave him money, how much money they gave him, right? All of these sorts of things, right? So you introduce a kind of, phenomenon into an ordinary environment, right? A field environment to see how people react to it. Now, again, the problem being you don't know why people did that, and you have to sort of speculate, or you'd have to grab them afterwards and kind of debrief them. Other things like, some fun ones people have done is like the piano key stairs, right? Where they put like these piano keys that play notes on a staircase, and basically have, so they see what happens when people step on a stair that makes a note, right? Whether people like just run up the stairs as fast as they can, or whether people like try to make music, these sorts of things, right? So they are, and there's lots of these, right? You could talk about, there's one, I'm trying to think of what it was called. They introduce smoke into a theater, right? Where it's like, you have someone go to a movie theater and you have different kinds of social situations where they introduce smoke, and then in one case, the people you've planted there don't react, right? They don't do anything as the room is filling up with this non-toxic smoke, and one where they kind of react slowly and move to the exit, and the other one where they start panicking to see how people react in those different situations based on how other people are acting. There's been tons of these, but again, they're sort of weirdly like in a natural, normal environment for people, but weirdly kind of artificial in their own way. Okay, so that's real life or field experiments, right? Introduce some kind of variable into a natural environment that people are already going to be in. Okay, laboratory experiments. This is much more typical in psychology. You bring people into a controlled research environment of some kind, and that's what this is the very famous one, right? A very famous lab experiment that now, was deemed unethical in retrospect, done in psychology, right? And basically, in that circumstance, they had someone, basically with a machine and a button, and they told them that every time they pushed the button, they would shock the person on the other side of the glass. They weren't actually shocking them. The person was just play acting. And basically, and they would tell them like every time you shock them, the voltage goes up. And they wanted to see, how, if a person being told by the researcher to continue shocking the person would continue to do it if they perceived they were causing pain to the person on the other side of the glass. Again, they weren't actually causing pain, but it caused some, scars to people who thought they were actually harming the person on the other side. So this is the kind of situation, right? A lab, or I think if I remember back to the weird experiment that I did when I took Psych 104, right? They brought me into a room. They were playing some kind of music in the background, and they asked me to solve some math problems. And then midway through, they changed the music to like heavy metal music. Like, how do people do, solving math problems while listening to different kinds of music, right? Weird things like that, right? Some kind of artificial environment. Okay, so laboratory experiments have certain advantages, obviously. You control the research environment, right? It's easy to randomly assign the subject to either, the experimental or control group based on, random assignment. So you can do that much more easily than in nature, right? Or in a natural environment. Easier to replicate, right? Someone can reproduce your protocol and basically go through and do the same experiment. But, one of the problems with it is it tends to have a really weak external validity, right? So outside of the particular circumstances that you introduced, it's not always possible to say, how it would apply in the real world because you've created an artificial circumstance. Is that a question? Your hand looks like it's half up.
I kind of want to tell you, but I kind of don't. It's kind of just a funny field experiment that is no longer valid either.
Okay.
It was a urinal experiment.
Okay.
They did a field experiment with all these men, and they would try and close specific urinals to see if they could force the men to stand next to each other, and they would just wait. If there was two urinals right next to each other, they would not. Yeah.
I feel that.
It's considered unethical because they weren't told that they were being observed while they were going to the washroom.
Yeah, that's creepy.
Yeah, it was very weird.
I think I would be upset. I'm like, I'm sorry, you're watching us in the bathroom?
Yeah.
What is wrong with you? Yeah, that doesn't sound I can see why that got banned. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly it, right? It's like, how can you manipulate some kind of normal circumstance that people would be in to see how they would react in those circumstances, right? Makes sense. Ugh, now I'm creeped out.
They won't do it again.
Or will they? They're psychologists. They're twisted, right? They read Freud. Something's wrong with them. Oh, sorry. I'm hard on psychology because I hate it. I think I spent most of my morning ranting about how Freud is dumb in sociology of youth. So that's fun.
Don't most psychologists agree with you that Freud wasn't like correct?
Yeah, but they still read it for some reason. Whereas I would be like, don't bother. Yeah, please.
Why don't you like Freud?
Because, oh.
And it's like you keep it real short, but like, I'm curious because you referenced it a couple times.
Because Freud randomly makes things up. Like, one of my least favorite ones for Freud is his entire theory of how religions emerged, which I probably spend like half a class in sociology of religion ranting about. He's literally like, oh, it's probably the situation where in some primeval tribe, the chief had all the women and was having sex with all the women. And he had a bunch of sons and they wanted to have sex with women too. So they killed him and then felt guilty. So they created religion. And I'm like, what is the basis for any of this? Just Freud's imagination. That's all. He just imagines that that's how religion must have emerged. And I'm not even being reductive about it. That's actually like his account. He writes it in much longer terms, but that's basically it. It's like, oh, we feel bad that we killed our father. Let's create religion to make ourselves feel better. And I'm like, what are you talking about? That's stupid. And I mean, all this like id, ego, super ego stuff, it's all completely made up. He's like, the psyche must be split into these three things. Why? I don't know. Sounds good though, doesn't it? I hate Freud. As I said in my class this morning, I'm like, I don't know which is the ego, the super ego, or the id that is supposed to be doing this, and I don't care because they're all made up anyway. That's why I don't like Freud, and I don't think we should be reading him anymore. And it always, right, he's like, men want to kill their fathers and marry their moms. And I'm like, yeah, no.
Talks a lot more about him than probably other people.
Yeah, Freud had daddy issues. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. All right, anyway, moving on from my sheer and utter hatred of Freud. Oh, all right. Key concepts relevant to experiments. Now, I will say, like, when you're doing your major labs, right, and you're doing sort of a research proposal, I'm going to really recommend strongly. I'm not going to say don't, but I'm going to recommend strongly research design, right, or experimental design, trying to come up with an experiment and provide like sample research materials is really difficult if you're doing a kind of laboratory experiment. It's not impossible, but I've tended to find that people who do that kind of design don't do as well because there's more kind of places that you can trip up. So I would say, like, honestly, and because I'm the one who created the assignment and I'm marking it, stick to questionnaires for the quantitative portion. And you'll do much better. You'll be happier. I'll be happier. It'd be a good time. Experimental design in sociology is really, really difficult just because it's so artificial compared to what we were looking for. Okay, so when we talk about experimental design, right, we typically have, sorry, it's my 4th hour of speaking today. My throat is starting to dry up a little bit. You have your treatment or experimental group, right? So this is typically the one that is being subjected to your independent variable, right? Or your treatment or manipulation, independent variable. That's what you're basically dealing with when you talk about your experimental group. Now, you also have your control group that does not get the treatment or manipulation. And again, you probably all know this. I'll tell you very quickly, just because maybe it bears repeating. You generally want to have a control group to make sure that you're actually seeing some kind of change, right? That this isn't something that you would observe normally in kind of normal circumstances, right? So you're going to have, me sitting in that room doing math problems and listening to first classical music and then, heavy metal music, and I do worse on the heavy metal part. And you're like, aha, and clearly heavy metal music is worse for doing math. but actually maybe you want a control group doing those same, math problems, because maybe your back half of your math problems were just really, really hard. And everybody did bad on it, and you're like, oh, my control group also did bad on it. Oops, we must have had something else going on, right? So you would need a control group in experimental situations to make sure that you're actually seeing a correlation with the introduction of your treatment or your manipulation. Experimental design, right? Random assignment, which is anyway. I was going to say something irrelevant. I'm going to stop. I was going to say how it's different from questionnaires. Let's not worry about that. Random assignment, right? Generally, you want to make sure in experimental design that you're randomly assigning participants either to the experimental or control group, so that you're not either manipulating the findings by putting certain people into a group. You want essentially a kind of random sample, as randomly mixed as you possibly can based on the sample sizes you're using. Random assignment to either the experimental or control group, and then pre-test and post-test, measurement of the dependent variable before experimental manipulation, and then measurement of the dependent variable after experimental manipulation, right? So once they switch the heavy metal music on, they want to measure my math skills after that. Joke's on them. I like heavy metal. Okay. So, right, so the manipulation of variables, right? Causality, right, basically is what you're trying to find out when you're looking at different kinds of research design in social science research, right? Mostly you're talking quantitative, but there's some qualitative experiments that you could do as well. It's generally expressed in variables, right? So I've been talking about independent and dependent variables, right? These are typically how you would talk about experimental design. Now, it can be a little bit confusing too, right? Because when we talk about when we get to statistics, right, and quantitative research using survey research, we use the terms independent variable and dependent variable as well, but in slightly different ways, right? When we're talking about this kind of usage of dependent and independent variables, right? Your independent variable here, you're talking about a specific manipulation, right? So like in this example, you're basically doing an experiment to see if ingesting caffeine would increase the number of words someone recalled, right? So you would probably, give them a list of words, have them try and remember as many as they can, read them and then repeat as many words back as possible. And then you give them, so that's your pretest, and then you give them a cup of coffee, and then you let them sit with it for 20 minutes because, it takes about 20 minutes to metabolize caffeine. And then you do the same thing with probably a different set of words, right? And so your independent variable is a cup of coffee or caffeine, right? When we talk about statistics, we're going to use those terms in slightly different ways, right? The independent variable, you'd be measuring like different aspects of, a particular group typically. So you'd be looking at, say, like socioeconomic status, right? How does socioeconomic status statistically affect something else, right? Religiosity or attitudes about gender norms, or, and you can do any number of things with it. So slightly different uses of independent and dependent variable. So I only say that, so keep it in mind, right? Because when I go to talking more about like surveys, it's the same words, but the meaning is a little bit different. Okay, so generally, it is some kind of expressed in some kind of language of variables. So it can be, one thing that you're introducing, that's your independent variable, or, when we talk about statistical research, right, we're talking about like categories and aspects or attributes of people. Okay. Right, so independent variables are manipulated to see if they have an impact in experimental design, to see if they have an impact on the dependent variable, right? So dependent is the outcome, right? So headache pain. Independent is whatever you're manipulating, right? Taking medicine, going for a run, getting a massage, right? Listening to classical versus heavy metal music. It could be any, like the independent variable could be any number of things, and you're trying to see what is the outcome, right? Is the effect. If you take Tylenol, does your headache decrease, right? If you listen to heavy metal music, do you get a headache, right? Or do you find it harder to concentrate? Like length of being able to concentrate, is it different if you have no noise or classical music or heavy metal music, right? These are all the sorts of things that you would find. And again, these are more typical of, I would say, psychology kind of experiments than social ones. Okay. Sorry, Emma, your hand moved and I thought, Emma has a question. No, you're good. Okay. Ooh. That's small on my screen. Maybe my eyes are old or tired or something. Okay, so classical experimental design, right? What does this look like? Independent and dependent variables are identified, right? So you figure out what they are. Dependent variable is observed or measured pre-test, right? So I get to sit in a room and do math problems because that's everyone's idea of fun. And they don't have any sound on, right? They have no music on, just a quiet room. And they measure, they come and they take the paper from me and they score my math test or whatever it happens to be, right? In each of the control and treatment groups, right? And you call this T1, right? So you represent it as, time 1. Then you introduce your independent variable for the treatment group while the control group is left alone and they get to continue, right? And this is T2. So their dependent variable, in this case, it's a bad example, but whatever, ability to do math problems is measured at, post-test in each of the control and treatment groups. So that is time 2, and any change in the groups are noted, right? So this is a classical experimental design, right? What happens, when you, before, right? And then you introduce the independent variable, and then you measure after, right? So again, this could be any number of things. There's a huge variety of different kinds of experiments. Yeah, Joan. Is it Joan? Yeah, I got it right.
Just a little bit about irrelevant, but with the heavy metal and classical music example, couldn't it be argued that the change is what could possibly cause the possible failing of math of the math questions? Because it's not like they took you to a room and they did a test, and then they took you to a different room and then you did a test, and they both started the same way, because you go from classical and then immediately switches to rock, right? So could it be argued that the change is what could be the cause of
and again, I may be, you have to keep in mind, I'm giving you an example because I was 15 years ago, and I might be remembering it wrong. So I've now created this narrative of how psychology sucks by this terrible example I'm giving you. But yeah, it might be the change to a different kind of music that causes, difficulty in concentrating. It's possible, yeah. But again, I may be misremembering the experiment too, and now painting psychology is dumb.
If you remember the outcome, there might be some explanation behind why they chose to do it in the middle, but I don't know, because if you don't really remember the outcome of the situation too, this study could have been thrown out. A lot of studies, they're like, yeah, you had a good idea, but actually it sucked.
That's entirely possible, right? So, and like I said, I'm just giving it as a example. And I don't know, I never got to read the research results or any of that stuff to really know what the study was about. I just remember what it was like, which was me sitting in a room listening to classical music, doing math, and then they took the test, gave me another one, and then put on heavy metal music. So that's all I remember. So I may not even be remembering it properly. Go ahead.
The people who took the test, do they have the same amount of mathematical
skill?
Yes.
Well, that's why you would have a bunch of people kind of randomly assigned, right? You'd have them from different kinds of faculties, and it's randomly assigned in either the control or the experimental group, so that basically, hopefully, you would get a good enough mix in both that you would see baseline skills differently varying on who signed up for the experiments.
But wouldn't it be better if you use people who had around the same mathematical skills, so you could eliminate or more or less eliminate the possibility of that being the reason of there being any change?
I mean, that would be better, but you don't always get to pick your, like, who is going to take part in your experiments, right? Like, sometimes, in a lot of cases, and in this case, what you would have been dealing with is a convenience sample. Whoever signs up to do your experiment is the people you get, and you can't always control for all of those variables. Yeah, please.
In certain cases, would they prefer to do that because then it makes it more applicable to real life? Because it's not as controlled as like synthetic environment or artificial because there's people from multiple backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, it depends on, I suppose, what you're trying to learn. I should go see if I can figure out who it was that did the study. It's going to be impossible. It was like 15 years ago. Go heckle the. I remember having to wander through the biosci building to try and find it, which also probably reduced my math skills because that building's a maze. I'm like, where am I? I'm lost. I also have bad spatial reasoning, but I mean, they're interesting questions, right? In the sense that, yeah, a more uniform sample would give you better results. You can't always control who you're going to get sign up to do an experiment. And yeah, if you have a more naturalistic kind of group, you'll get a better idea of how it might apply in real world circumstances, right? And it might have been just like stress, right? Are they measuring stress? So they introduce a stressful variable, right? Yeah, or even like turn the heat up, right? Like raise the temperature, right? So suddenly someone's feeling more stressed and grumpy. Turn on unpleasant music. Jokes on them. Heavy metal's not that bad. All these sorts of things can be ways of trying to understand, how people react in these circumstances and all that. But anyway, I don't want to defend this experiment because, like I said, I only remember it through a glass darkly of my memory. But yeah, that's essentially it. Oh, I am losing my voice again. Okay, right. So this is kind of what it. Oh, this is a really interesting experimental design. I'll tell you about this because it's actually one of those situations actually where potentially a kind of social experiment was done that came up with some really interesting and kind of applicable kind of insights. Okay, so this is a very famous study, right? And basically, so there is an element of deception in this. So I don't know if you could actually repeat it today, but basically one of the things, they did this somewhere in the US, and basically they went into an elementary school classroom and they proposed to give every single student in that class an IQ test, right? So they gave the test and then they reported the results back to the teacher. However, it wasn't a real IQ test. What they did was they made up the scores randomly and assigned it to random students in the class. And basically those that they said, they reported that some, were gifted and some were just average, right? So basically sorry, I'm having too much fun in explaining this. So they observed, right? So they said they observed IQ at, time 1. And then what they did, so they created by telling the teacher which kids were gifted. I'm messing it up. Let me go back one step. They actually did do an IQ test with real results, but they misreported it to the teacher, right? So they told the teacher like fake results. They put some kids randomly in the gifted category and they put some in the, average category. So they told the teacher this and they created basically, teacher expectations, right? That some kids were gifted. And what they found was that when they observed IQs at time 2, 8 months later, those that they had put into the category of gifted and therefore created teacher expectations that these kids were gifted, actually had increases in their IQ. And those that they didn't, IQs had basically remained the same. And basically what the kind of conclusion of this experiment was, and in debriefing the teachers, what they found was that after they suggested that these, what they called the spurters had gifted IQs, teachers gave them more attention, right? And fostered their abilities more, gave them more one-on-one attention because the teachers believed that these kids had a lot of potential to do really well. And so given attention and all that extra treatment, they actually did do pretty well, right? They actually moved forward in their IQ. And then those that they classed as average, the teachers basically didn't give extra attention to, and their IQs essentially remained the same, right? So observe IQ, misreport, you know, to either create expectation or not of ability, and then observe again 8 months later, and you find your kind of design. Now, again, this one is interesting because A, no real harm was caused, and B, it showed that sometimes the way that adults, in this case teachers, react to students based on their expectations of that student can change, a kind of life outcome or IQ in the short term, right? Yeah, please.
Were the kids made aware?
Oh, I can't remember. Okay, so the kids did not know what their actual IQ test was during the experiment. I don't remember if there was a debrief afterwards telling the parents what had happened. I don't recall whether that was the case, but during the experiment, the kids didn't know.
So the kids that were put in like the gifted group didn't have that expectation of themselves?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't believe so. I think they were not told. It was just to the teachers. Now I'd have to go back and reread. I'm like, did the kids know? I don't think they were told anything about the IQ test so as not to bias the experiment. But I don't 100% remember that part of the experiment. But I'm pretty sure they wouldn't, because otherwise people would be like, I'm really smart. And then you'd have, you'd be introducing a spurious variable of like belief in self, and that might.
Sure, but like to what extent could the researchers control, like, is the researcher saying, I think you're gifted and you can get this or whatever, right?
I believe they just told the teacher, but maybe I will check before Wednesday.
Anything in place that made sure that like the teacher wasn't saying, I think you're gifted and this is,
Oh, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that they told the teachers not to tell the IQ results because they were going to measure them again. But I'd have to go back and actually look at the parameters of the study. But yeah, please.
Is it not unethical because now the teachers are treating the students with, that they would have lower expectations for, with like
Less well?
Yeah.
Potentially.
Like some of those students could have had so much potential, but their teachers just kind of like pushed them aside and said like, let me focus on these.
I think probably here where you would get away with it is the duration, right? Like it's a relatively short time duration. So it's only, I know 8 months for a kid is a long time. And they're not like that kid is stupid. They're just like average. So, the teacher's not treating them like they're dumb.
But maybe the teacher would have treated them all less than students because they had high expectations for had they not known.
It's hard to control for that kind of stuff too, right? And so, yeah, it's possible, but I think the assumption is that only when you introduce the idea that some students are gifted is the teacher going to give them extra attention. They wouldn't all have gotten, more attention had they,
And then these kids where the teachers have lower expectations and they're given less attention, they end up feeling stupider because they're comparing themselves to their classmates that are getting more attention.
yeah.
It could be like pivotal.
It's possible. I'm not on the research ethics board, so if this ever comes up, I'll definitely kill it. Yeah, please.
I think part of the research is like you're making the assumption that you're giving extra time to a student, but you're also taking away some time from another student, like always, depending on. And some students need extra time with teachers and some don't. But they might try and prioritize kids who are a little gifted. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that in their own lives where like, my sibling was gifted, but I wasn't, or I was gifted, but my sibling wasn't. And then you see like the different outcomes in that. I think that's why they were trying to focus on that. I don't know. Like,
Yeah,
that's my assumption.
Again, I'd have to reread like the whole research study to see all of that.
What if all the kids could have been gifted if you give them the same thing?
That's what the.
You're like, I'm sure they
I think that's what they're trying to prove with the study, right? It's like if we treated everybody with the level of attention we think that gifted students get, then everybody could make tremendous progress, right?
Because some of the people who were treated like they were gifted were
Actually average, right? Or even maybe below average, right? But they all made progress in terms of IQ because they got that extra attention. So the idea is, well, if we found a way to give every kid extra attention or one-on-one, then yeah, everybody moves forward in terms of what they can achieve. So, I mean, it might also be like, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet kind of idea of research is like, we have to mistreat these children so that future children can get better outcomes. Just probably not a good ethical principle. Sorry?
Did the education system even improve after the experiment?
Oh, almost assuredly not, right? Just because we have the knowledge doesn't mean we do anything with it. That's the other thing you should know about social research is sometimes we know lots of things and we don't do anything about it. And then so we keep learning the same lessons over and over again. Prison researchers notoriously find this incredibly frustrating because there's pretty consistent research findings out of prisons that these kinds of programs would help, and yet those programs never get funded. It's always just lock more people up. So, and I know this because I work with a bunch of prison researchers and they just want to hit their head against the wall most of the time. They're like, we know this, we've done so much research. Here's my CV. It's like this many studies. And people are like, okay, but how long should we lock them up for? And should we keep them in solitary more or less? You're like, never. It's terrible for them. So you're saying more, yeah, please.
It's interesting how much financial incentive there is within prison systems to keep people in prison systems. I think that's why we see a lot of prison research, but then we never see anything come out of the prison research because they're basically giving people free labor. They do a lot of work in these types of institutions. So you're put to work, and they're like, great, free labor, you get like a couple of cents to maybe buy some stuff while you're in prison. So there's incentive for them to keep locking people up.
Yeah, I mean, basically, right? Just because we know something doesn't mean that it gets put into practice, and often knowledge and praxis are two very different things done by very different people, right? Researchers can know something and try to communicate it. Policymakers might be like, yeah, we don't have the budget for that, and you're done, right? So that's the way it goes. I mean, certainly you'd probably all learn better at university in 30-person classrooms rather than like what I had an hour ago, which was 230. But, there we go. Okay. Anyway, that's just an example, but interesting. I like how into it y'all are getting with with these examples. Okay. What am I talking about? I've completely lost my train of thought. Now I'm thinking about school research and let me get my brain recentered. Okay. So, right. Ideally, if you're doing an experiment, you'll only see the change in the experimental or treatment group. If you see the change in both groups, something else is causing the change, right? So your experimental design at that point has basically failed, right? You've had a problem. True experimental evidence would eliminate all other possibilities or rival explanations for the change in the dependent variable in the treatment group. Now, this isn't always possible, right? There's always other kind of possibilities. But, if you had a perfect research design, it would eliminate all other possible changes. Most social experiments involve complex issues. So it's not always possible. Let's hope the control group and random distribution of subjects will increase their internal validity. But sometimes, right, things just don't work out that way. Oh, let me think if I can think of an example of this. Do you know the marshmallow test? You've heard of the marshmallow test? Okay, some people, yes, some people know. The marshmallow test was this very famous experiment where they basically got a bunch of preschoolers and they offered them the possibility of, I'm going to leave you alone in a room with this marshmallow. Now, if you can control yourself and not eat it for 5 minutes until I come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows, right? Assuming, of course, that kids all like marshmallows because they're sweet and fluffy and delightful. And basically what they did was they observed then which kids had eaten the marshmallow versus the kids that waited and got the 2 marshmallows. And then they tracked these kids, for a few years to see what kind of life outcomes they ended up with. And their conclusion from this study was, the kids with, more self-control who didn't eat the marshmallow generally had better life outcomes, right? Now, as time has gone on, right, and people have attempted to reproduce the marshmallow experiment with different, and people have tried it with cookies or other sweet treats and all sorts of different kind of permutations of essentially the same research question. One of the things that was found with that original study is they hadn't sufficiently controlled for things like parental education, socioeconomic class, race. I think the first sample was almost entirely white. And so, basically it was the kids that ended up doing better had a whole bunch of other kind of influences in their lives that led them to do better, like they were wealthier and came from better neighborhoods and went to better public schools. And subsequent kind of experiments of the marshmallow test that have tried to reproduce it with different groups or a more properly mixed group have found much more mixed results. It's like, yes, the kids who, in some cases, who can control themselves better have more delayed gratification, tended to have better life outcomes, but it's marginal as compared to that first study. Because they didn't, that first study didn't really look at all the possible rival explanations. It just like went down to this one thing, which was like ability to delay gratification. So when we talk about, and that's one of the problems with social experiments, right? It's not always down to, say, the individual psychological state of that one kid. There's a lot of other factors like socioeconomic class, parental education, neighborhood, what public school they go to. There's a lot of things that can play into some, even like innate IQ, which IQ is not a great measure, but innate intelligence and skill, all of these sorts of things that can really play into, whether someone succeeds in life. So social experiments have that problem that sometimes there's so many possible inputs that it's hard to determine which one is really having the effect. Oh, my targets. Okay. Okay. So, in validity, right? Validity is a big question in any kind of social research, right? Now we're talking here about experimental design, but in general, right, we can talk about validity in a bunch of different, validity is really what you're looking for, right? You want validity because, validity assesses the extent to which your research study addressed the issue the researcher was intending to explore. Like, did you get results that are you studying the right thing, right? Internal validity, right, is concerned with the extent to which what's interpreted as the cause of any phenomenon is actually the cause, right, of a phenomenon that's produced. Reliability, I guess, let me explain reliability like this. Reliability and validity, right? So when we talk about validity, right, basically you're wanting to make sure that you're measuring the right thing, right? That's really what validity is, right? Are you measuring what you're intending to measure, right? So let's say, and this is not a great social example, but I think it's an illustrative one nevertheless, right? If I am, jumping on the bathroom scale and, on the bathroom scale, it says that I am 250 pounds, right? And every time I get on, it says 250 pounds, 250 pounds, 250 pounds. We would say that that measurement is reliable, right? Because I'm getting the same result over and over again. So I'm reliably getting the same result. However, we wouldn't say that it's valid, right? Because I'm actually not 250 pounds, at least not yet. The way things are going, I could get that way one day, but so far, throw in a couple more runs and I might avoid that fate. But I am significantly less than 250 pounds. So you can't say that the measurement of 250 pounds is valid because, it would be, my weight plus about 45 pounds, right? So it's measuring, weight, it's doing it reliably, but it's not valid because that's not actually my weight that's being displayed. It's my weight plus, whatever amount it happens to be. So reliable, but not valid, right? So that'd be here, right? You're getting, your cluster of things, the scale is measuring me within X range, but it's not actually measuring what it's intended to measure, which is my weight. It's measuring something else, my weight plus XYZ. Unreliable and invalid. Let's say I get on the scale one time, it's like, okay, 75 pounds. Next time I get on 180. Next time I get on 240. Right now it's all over the place and it's not reliable and it's not valid. It's not measuring my weight and it's not it's not measuring my weight and it's not measuring anything reliably, right? So your goal with any kind of research, right, is you want, and when you're getting results, is you want reliable and valid, right? So you want to be getting pretty consistent results based on the methodology, and you want it to actually be measuring what you're measuring, right? So yeah, I mean, internal validity, concerned with the extent to which what's interpreted as the cause and the cause and effect phenomenon actually produce the effect, right? Are you actually, correctly measuring what you're trying to measure, right? And some of your questions are kind of aimed in this direction, right? About things like the teacher experiment, right? Is the way they conducted the experiment actually measuring, the impact of teachers' attention, or is it measuring something else, right? Shifts in teacher attention, or the self-esteem of students when they were told X, Y, Z, right? Or when they realized the teacher was now spending more time with Tina than them, whereas it had been the other way, and then they started to feel bad about them. Are you measuring what you're trying to measure correctly? So when you talk about your results, are they, valid inside your own experiment? In other words, is the extent to which any given research design is, it is about the extent to which any given research design is a good test of the hypothesis, right? Are you actually measuring what you're hoping to measure? Or did you accidentally end up measuring something else that wasn't part of your hypothesis, right? What's my example? Did the study establish that the personal income level in Canada really is influenced by one's level of education, right? Could it be influenced by something else? The region where you live, right? Things like that. Okay. Okay, 11. Yo, sorry, please.
Just gonna ask,
I'll go back.
clarification, if I'm hard to understanding that specific one, but could you give me another example of unreliable and valid?
Unreliable.
Sorry. Just didn't click.
Okay. Unreliable, but I'm trying to think if they're like unreliable but valid. Oh, let me see if I can. That one's a tough one. I'm trying to think if there's an example I could think of that's social. You don't want to do unreliable and invalid? That one's way easier.
That's the one I'm having a hard time with.
Unreliable but invalid? No, you're thinking unreliable but valid. Yeah, that one's, basically, like, the idea behind unreliable and valid is you're correctly designed your question, right, or your research tool to get the kind of information that you're trying to get, right? So let's say, I don't know, that you're talking about like the effect of teacher action on, student IQ, right? Let's say you've correctly figured out the way to do that so that you're measuring the right thing, but your results are all over the place, right? Like, in one kid, you gave them extra attention and their IQ got lower. And in one, you gave them extra attention, they stayed the same. So all of a sudden, like, you're like, okay, I know that, like, because let's say I've repeated someone else's procedure. I did the same experiment they did. They were getting the right results. I'm pretty confident, but the results are all over the board. I'm not getting any consistent kind of movement in one direction from my independent variable, right? Then you're probably thinking there's something wrong with the research design, or there's another factor that's affecting these sorts of things. So you're doing the test right, but you're getting results that don't make any sense, right? Yeah, Joan.
I thought it was listening to you. It reminds me of like back in high school where in chemistry class or was it physics, where in science class we were talking about position.
Some science, they're all the same at the end of the day, right?
We were talking about position versus accuracy, and like I think that really reminds me of it because like position is like things being close together, and accuracy is things being correct. I think that's like really close to validity versus reliable versus
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's been a while since I did high school chemistry or physics also. I dropped out of physics. I didn't like it. It was not. Yeah, please.
So would it be fair to say it's sort of like akin to you did it correctly, but your hypothesis was wrong?
Yeah, or there's probably some other, like, you're measuring it correctly, but something else their hypothesis is wrong. Something else is causing the actual result you're seeing, right? So your measure would be valid, but your results are not going the way you want, right? You're like, we gave extra attention to the kids, but some of them, got higher IQs, some of them didn't. I don't know, could have come down to something else, right? But yeah, you're basically there. I spilled tea on myself. I'm sad now, and I have to go outside and freeze to death. It'll be great. Okay, I'm like 7 minutes. Can I do this test in 7 minutes? Did you just want to quit for the day? Are you all done? Okay, let's leave it there. I know it's a long class. It's hard to pay attention for 80 minutes. Okay, let's leave it there. We'll pick it up on Wednesday. We'll keep going. Oh yeah. Let's see. All right, yes. Let's pick it up on Wednesday. We'll see you then. Okay. I know you're like, no, there's too much text on that.